Hello and welcome to The Table. Hosted by Planet Pulse Pacific, this podcast series explores the hidden cost of our food. This is a supplementary full-length interview from the Edible Empire series. For the full story and context surrounding this conversation, we encourage you to listen to the 6 main episodes. We're your hosts, Emma, Ben and Neil, with Kelly on editing. Connecting from across the globe, we would like to take a moment and acknowledge the traditional custodians and their millennia of stewardship. We honour their deep, ongoing connection to lands and the environments that we discuss throughout this series. So, let's begin. Professor Raj Patel is a political economist, academic, writer, documentary filmmaker and activist whose work examines hunger, corporate power and inequality in global food systems, with a focus on how capitalism structures who eats and who profits. Professor Patel, thank you so much for joining us.
Please call me Raj. It's great to be here.
Well, Raj, thank you. Could you please give our listeners a brief insight into your journey that led you to becoming an expert on the influence of power within our food system?
I got into the food system just by seeing extreme poverty when I was a kid. We were in India, in the land of my ancestors, and there was a girl knocking at the window and she had an infant in her hand and she was intoning and asking for money and she was hungry. And I was 5 years old and I lost my shit. And I was really upset and I couldn't understand why, she was hungry and we weren't, and why we had money and she didn't. After that, as soon as I got home, I started renting out my toys in kindergarten for famine relief. The issue of hunger has been with me. The issue of power has come really through an understanding of trying to end that hunger and being frustrated by power. Charity obviously doesn't work. It's vital and it's important, and there is a dignified emergency among the hungry right now, and it needs to be attended to right now. But that emergency will persist unless we confront that power. After volunteering and then working at NGOs and then working within the UN and some of these sort of international bodies, the organizations with the clearest vision of this that I found were movements like La Via Campesina, the International Peasant Movement. And so it's through and alongside them and working with social movements that this issue of power has become clearest to me, because the moment you try and change something in the food system for the better, for more equality, is the moment you come up against power fairly clearly.
Thanks very much, Raj. I mean, you mentioned power there. For our listeners, this might be the first time they think about power in a food system. Can you just run us through that?
Well, there's an easy way of thinking about the food system, which is that there are hundreds of millions of farmers around the world and billions of consumers. But between the farmers and us as consumers, there's just a handful of corporations. And this concentration of market power is the reason why in every major food market, there's just a handful of players. In the supermarket realm, it's going to be sort of Walmart and Amazon and Aldi and Carrefour. And, in seeds, it's going to be Monsanto or Pioneer Hybrid and BASF and Sinochem. There'll be just a handful of corporations controlling the overwhelming majority of a market. Now, that suggests that all the ideas that we have about free markets, of going into the supermarket and seeing aisles of plenty and seeing all of this stuff being made just for us, gets it exactly wrong. That actually the modern supermarket is a place not where stuff is made for us, but where we are made for our food. Because if there are only a handful of corporations that are peddling this stuff to us, then we need to be refashioned into the kinds of people who think that the wildest things on those supermarket shelves are normal. And that's why we often hear this sort of refrain about why we should eat more like our great-grandparents. Now, we can argue whether that's a good idea or not, but one thing is certainly true, is that we eat nothing like them. And many of the reasons we eat nothing like them is because of power in shaping our tastes and in our expectations of what food is. So that now we're drinking amazingly strange stuff like Red Bull, for example, which, if you were trying to explain Red Bull to your ancestor, you'd be like, well, it's sugar. Oh, I know what that is. And it's caffeine. I know what that is. And then it's creatine and taurine. And these are chemicals most commonly found in urine. If you're trying to explain why you're eating sugary caffeinated piss to your ancestor, there's a problem there. And yet it's perfectly normal. Here we are drinking Red Bull. And I think that that's an example of power at work in a way that's so subtle that it's transformed us into these strange creatures that find that kind of beverage perfectly acceptable. I got no moral high ground, and my PhD work was fueled by Red Bull. There's no moral high ground or sort of sanctimoniousness here. But I'm just saying, isn't it weird that we're like this?
Is there something in particular that really stood out for you when you first started studying food systems and, I suppose, hunger alongside that?
The thing that still boggles me is how successful the food industry is at getting everyone to pick up the tab. I found a report in 2012 that was by KPMG, the management consultancy. This is not an organization of bomb-throwing anarchists. It assessed a range of industries around the world, and it looked at the oil and gas industry and telecoms and electricity and what have you. And it said, well, look, if we have a very conservative calculation of the amount of damage this industry is doing, and we express that as a percentage of the revenue of this industry, what do we get? And they found the oil and gas industry has 24% of its revenue, if you put a dollar value to the damage it causes, is environmental harm. So you could imagine an oil and gas industry that if the industry managed to take 24% of its revenue and pay it off to the environment, that you would have a sort of environmentally neutral business. And this is oil and gas, right? This is fairly nasty in terms of pollution. But there was one industry that they looked at where no matter how they did the math, the damage outweighed the revenue of the industry, and not by a little, but by a lot. And that's the food industry. And what they found was that for every dollar you spend on food, $2.40 of damage is caused. And that still blows my mind. You might think, oh, well, this is just KPMG getting the numbers wrong again. But this was a finding that was then replicated by independent calculations from the Rockefeller Foundation. The model that they use, independently formulated. And again, they ran the numbers. And here in the United States, they found pretty much the same thing, that for every dollar we spend on food, we spend $1 on healthcare, treating the diseases that come from that food, and then an additional dollar and a bit cleaning up the environment and a range of other things. And then a very small part of that is also government subsidy, but a vanishingly small fraction. Mainly, the food industry has, over the course of its history, managed to find elaborate ways that no other industry has of getting other people to pay for the damage that it causes.
So given its dependence on things like ecological depletion and power imbalance, do you see our current global food system as stable, or is it structurally crisis prone, or is it just completely broken?
The last two, for sure. I don't think there is a way to do the current food system sustainably. And again, that's not me saying that, that's the food industry. I mean, I had a fine conversation with the environmental sustainability guy at Nestle, and I asked him about these KPMG figures, and I said, is it true that the food industry produces more environmental and social harm than the revenue? And he goes, well, yeah, I mean, everyone knows that. But if we published our data, we'd be crucified. So I'm not conjuring some wild and unsustainable industry just because I think capitalism is bad. This is capitalism working as it ought, insofar as other people are picking up the tab. The industry is incredibly powerful and incredibly adept at bribing the right officials when it needs to, evading regulation, and in general setting up the expectation. I think this is the most powerful weapon in its arsenal, is setting up the expectation that large parts of the world ought to be devoted to the production of meat or palm oil or whatever it is, so that we can have cheap snacks, and that should be perfectly normal. I mean, that's an incredible amount of power. So yeah, it's broken structurally, and it's making things much worse. Even if we've solved climate change in terms of energy production, we would still overshoot every planetary boundary because of the food system and the way that it operates right now.
You said sustainability person at Nestle. Do you think these corporates, because you also mentioned that they wouldn't dare publicize the actual true figures, do you think it's the flip around? How much are they actually trying to hide the negative impacts of their business?
Well, yeah, I mean, they're in the PR business, and they, Nestle for ages has had to do things like justify the way that it markets baby milk formula, and the way it continues to violate international norms around that. It's not. Again, this isn't some secret hidden inside a vault somewhere. This is an open secret that these industries are trying, are in general in the business of social harm in order to be able to make profit. But the rise of the sustainability officer or the chief environment officer is in part because of feelings in the 2010s and the success of some of these campaigns against these companies, that they had to make some concessions. There are the argument I'm making is that most of the things that we need to do to live on a sustainable planet will be a net loss to these industries. However, there are a small number of things that are a net win for the planet and a net win for the company. And that's what the environmental officer urges us to look towards. And so you end up with things like solar panels on top of Walmart. for example, right? This is the or energy efficiency in Walmart's trucking routes. And I'm like, that's great. Actually, if they're pumping out less CO2, or if they're electrifying in order to be able to provide air conditioning inside, rather than causing us to use more fossil fuels, that's a win. But that's as good as it gets. If we're interested in more structural transformation, then there's no sustainability officer who'd be like, maybe we should just get people to buy a little less. That's not going to fly.
And you mentioned the word cheap there. Many of our listeners will know you've written a book called "The History of the World in 7 Cheap Things," and a lot of people will think that cheapness is a good thing, particularly around food. It's affordable, it's efficient, it's fast. Could you talk us through your understanding of cheapness with respect to the food system?
Yes, I mean, so in the History of the World in 7 Cheap Things, which I co-authored with the brilliant Jason W. Moore, what we looked at was precisely how capitalism works. And if you want the sort of cliff notes, or the sort of back of envelope guide to what capitalism is a system that doesn't pay its bills. And insofar as, so this is why the food system is a paradigm case, right? The food industry is a paradigm case. If you can get someone else to pick up the tab for environmental destruction, if you can get someone to figure out other ways of making sure that your labor is underpaid, then, or if you can figure that out yourself, you're able to make a greater profit. And cheap isn't the same as affordable. I think that's a really important division, because I desperately want food to be affordable, and I think there are really good ideas that are now rising to the surface about the possibility of a public food system. We saw Mayor Mamdani win an election here with one of his promises being to have grocery stores throughout New York City, both as a way of tackling the affordability crisis, but also tackling the symptoms of that, which is a loss in dignity. If you can't live in a city, in a dignified way, and you have to schlep across town to be able to get your fresh fruits and vegetables, that's an undignified way of living in town, as you try to meet this affordability crisis. So there are solutions, and more and more places are thinking more systematically about what would it be like to have a public supply chain, and what would it be like to actually push back against this food imperialism by making sure that we were buying locally, that we were making sure that everyone in the food system was paid justly along the way, that we weren't environmentally destructive, and that when we had food for sale, it reflected that full cost, but that everyone could afford it, because we had, while recognizing that cheapness needs to be driven out of the food system, affordability reflects the capacity to be able to pay, and that means raising wages. You can't talk about a just food system without recognizing the sort of dire crisis in the working class around the lack of affordability. But cheap food won't do that, because if you want to have cheap food, one of the ways that the food industry has succeeded time and again is to underpay workers. I mean, here in the US, 7 out of the 10 worst paying jobs are in the food system. And so if you're interested in tracking where food insecurity is, you look to people who are working in the food system providing that cheap food. Hence, cheap food is not a great way to make sure that food is affordable for precisely the working class that needs it the most.
What frameworks help you understand and have helped you understand the food system, and might be useful for our listeners to think about how the food system operates?
When I was 5, I just thought in terms of fairness. It's just not fair that there are people in the world who are hungry when there are lots of people with food. I was looking at liberal economics and neoclassical economics as a way of explaining why it is that there are some costs over here, and how comparative advantage might work, and why certain parts of the world were just destined to make bananas so that the rest of the world could enjoy them. But ultimately, I think it's important to return to the origins of economics, which were always political economics, right? That you couldn't understand the exchange of goods without understanding the legal structures of the markets in which they were transacted. And that means thinking like the old political economists. I happen to think that Marxism is kind of helpful here, because it helps you understand not only how it is that these capitalist markets work, but also their tendency towards crisis, the tendency to look for fixes elsewhere, and the tendency also to perpetually be looking for fixes internationally, to be looking for ways of solving labor crises, for example, or energy crises or raw materials crises domestically by having imperial powers solve that by going overseas. And I think if our project here is to think about an early warning system for food imperialism, then looking at some of the sort of original mechanisms for achieving that, particularly the way the British behaved in India, can be super, super helpful. Because India is sort of the paradigm case of economics at work. The example that I think is sort of super fascinating is that you've got India at the beginning of the 1800s as a thriving and incredibly wealthy series of kingdoms and fiefdoms, and by the end of the 18th century reduced to absolute penury, far, far, far poorer than Europe. And in between the operative event is British colonization. And the British came in and they were pretty canny about the ways that they approach landowners. And so if we're thinking about a way of being on guard for food imperialism, looking at the negotiations between these foreign powers and the owners of land is definitely an area that deserves immediate attention. Because what the British said was, hey, zamindars, landowners, rajas, maharajas, you're stuck in this feudal era where if one year your harvests fail, it's your responsibility as a maharaja to look after your workers. And the problem with that is that then you have to make sure that everyone gets fed, and you have to worry about grain stores, and you have to worry about social equilibrium, and you have to worry about maintaining some sort of position in this moral economy. But if you didn't have to worry about feeding your peasants in times of crisis, you would be able to produce way more food, and you would be able to export it to us, the British, and we would pay you a lot of money for that. And through these economic arguments and then straight military inducements, the sort of feudal system was dismantled. And that meant the systems that had been developed over millennia in India to be able to combat famine or combat crop failure or being ravaged by pests or by disease, all of that was dismantled. And the British, in a way, didn't lie. By the end of the 1800s, India was producing more food per person than it ever had in its history. So there was absolutely a productivity explosion, lots more food. But the problem was that the people who were growing the food couldn't afford to eat it because they were being priced out of the market by the British. And so you had people who were dying alongside these vast new empires of food being shipped out of the country. And the Journal of the British Statistical Society was a little mortified to find that in consulting the records before the British arrived, you'd have a famine once every 120 years. But after the British arrived and after they'd been bringing in this new era of productivity, there was a famine once every 4 years. So if you were in a time machine and you saw a famine in pre-British invasion, you'd have to wait more than a century to see another one. But if after the British came, you saw a famine, you could expect one in the regularity of an election cycle. And that's a predictable consequence of the market because you're selling food to the highest bidder. But if we're interested in food imperialism, then look at what the food imperialists were doing. They were imposing this sort of free market. They were encouraging free trade. They were getting cheap food cheapened at the cost of the lives of Indians and at the expense of the soil and the depletion of water, and taking it all the way over to the UK where it was feeding its workers who otherwise would be restive because their food was too expensive. And that system is what food imperialism looks like. It involves the dismantling of certain kinds of moral economy that are working very well to make sure that no one starves. And instead, you see, again, what one of the sort of signatures of food imperialism is an increase in the level of hunger at the same time as you see an increase in the amount of food being produced.
Shifting a little bit toward now, I guess, solutions. You've touched on this a little bit about social and environmental impacts. Now, if those are hidden by the food supply chains, deliberate or not, do you think that policies that require greater transparency could actually help bring us toward a fix of some sort?
Imagine you're going to the supermarket and you pick up the label, and now what it tells you is this food was produced with this much labor exploitation. And not only that, but here are the people who are exploited. And you scan the QR code and you see them waving at you. Also, this food involved this much water depletion. It also involved this much pesticides, some of which may be inside. It also involved the leveling of this area of land, which used to be home to this amazing biodiversity of things. Plus, this involved a certain amount of child labor, the extinction of these indigenous species, and the exploitation of these people. You're reading a fucking thesis before you're buying a bar of chocolate, which is fine, because it's better to be informed than not informed. And at the same time, if there's 100% transparency, what does that do? It just tells you, hey, guess what? Everything that you're doing involves such a huge cost that the price of this bar needs to be several times more than it is. There's transparency for you. I don't think much of transparency. We're here in the US where the Epstein files are circulating. The Epstein files is super interesting precisely because of what it says about transparency, which is These guys are going to do what they're going to do. And here's a window into it. Good luck prosecuting them. Good luck actually trying to make any change once you've got the transparency. Now, it's better to know than to not know. And transparency isn't a policy. Transparency is just being able to see how badly you're being fucked.
If we were to build a food system centered on justice rather than just profit, what would be structurally different? What does that look like to you?
So we're recording right now at the end of February 2026. There's a big summit happening in Colombia at the moment on land reform. And it's interesting that yesterday here in the United States, the president of the United States was talking about how we shouldn't let large corporations buy up housing so that people in America can have houses. But this fight for the land beneath your home is a global one. And I think if we're interested in food systems, we have to talk about land. We have to talk about land reform, because one of the things that keeps this food system looking the way that it does is a distribution of land, particularly the distribution of large-scale farms, that comes with the large concentration of power and with a certain kind of food system that has evolved to make money off farms at that scale. But most people don't eat soy. Here in the United States, we grow corn on very, very large farms. The biggest single use for that corn here in the United States is ethanol. So we're growing food not to eat it, but to set it on fire. All of that suggests that actually, if we want a sustainable food system, we will need to think about not just what is it that we're going to grow, but what are the accompanying social and biological and physical technologies that come with the shift to something more just. So yes, we do need to talk about land reform. We absolutely have to talk about wages, right? I mean, you can't have an end to cheap food without an end to cheap work. And that means for everyone to be able to afford food as a human right. There are only a couple of countries that don't think that food is a human right. The United States and Israel have consistently opposed the idea of food as a human right at the United Nations. But most other countries have it somewhere on the books, that there is something that's important about being a citizen that entitles you not to starve. And I like that idea. The idea of food as a human right points towards ways of getting food that will be more sort of socially and environmentally sustainable. So it's a big question, Emma. And the great news is that there are lots of places that are experimenting with public supply chains, with paying farmers extra if they're farming agroecologically and making sure that those crops end up in local schools. So providing more money for the farmer and providing food for children that is demonstrably better for them than the standard American diet. These kinds of ways in which governments can do the right thing, I think is quite important. But then the question comes, well, how do we get that? And this is where social movements matter, because governments won't do this, particularly given the power of these large corporations, by their own volition. Here in the US, the largest contributor to Trump's inaugural ball was JBS, the Brazilian meat conglomerate. There's not buying political favor as JBS's superpower. They did that and went to jail for it in Brazil, and they're doing that in the United States too. Being able to fight back against that requires organizing, and it requires politics, and it requires movement formation. And social movements have been, in general, fighting rearguard action against the food industry. But again, occasionally the food industry will offer a SOP, like a chief environment officer or whatever it is. But increasingly, we're seeing the failure of those cosmetic solutions. And that's why there are so many places that are now interested in more root and branch transformation, in thinking about what a public supply chain might do. Now, land reform appears in Donald Trump's speech in a very arcane way. But it's interesting that he's saying it at all. For Trump to be able to say we want fewer corporations owning part of the housing stock is unusual, but it points to how the horizon of possibility has shifted a little bit. There wasn't anyone, Democrat or Republican here in the United States, who would have dared say such a thing in the past 50 years. And now all of a sudden, it's not just a thinkable thing. Even the Democrats have been sort of goaded into providing an inadequate policy as an example of how they're the side of the people. But all of this suggests that there's more interest in thinking through how states can do things because people are restive and increasingly quite upset about the affordability crisis. And as food imperialism breaks down, which is always inherently fragile, right? It's always a fix to a problem that then itself needs fixing, and then you patch it again, and then all of a sudden things go sideways. We're in this weird moment where there's no outside to go. The frontiers that capitalists are exploring now are bloody Mars, or chips in your brain, or new kinds of battery chemistry. But when it comes to the food system, we're out of frontiers. There's no new land to claim. And that means there's reason to worry about the violence that will attend those who are trying to defend land. It's certainly getting worse for land defenders now than it ever has been in the past 50 years. I've been sort of studying this. But I think that there's a way of thinking about possibility here where movements are also organizing, and there is a groundswell in this moment of movements that are really pushing the frontier back and imagining what a sort of collective and just food system might look like.
Speaking of British influence and land equity, what about looking at something like the reversal of the enclosure system that started in England 100, 200 years ago, longer.
Yeah, I mean, for listeners who may not know, I mean, one of the inciting incidents for English capitalism and for world capitalism, and in fact, in almost every society where indigenous people were had ways of being on the land, private property was kind of weird. And it took violence and treaty to be able to enclose that land. And by enclose, that means being able to turn what is a gift from nature to which one belongs into something that belongs to you. And that, just the weird kind of semantic jujitsu there points to the utter sort of transformation that's required in order to be able to get capitalism to work. But to be able to say, abracadabra, now everything is unowned, is not necessarily going to fix things. This reminds me of the Israeli kindergarten problem, and it's just called this because there was a study done in a kindergarten in Israel where the folk there were upset that parents were coming late to pick up their kids. And so they said, well, all right, what we're going to do is institute a fine. And so that way, if you pick your kids 10 minutes late, then, you're going to have to pay us whatever it is, shekels. You're going to have to pay just a reasonable amount of money. But parents were wealthy enough to be able to treat this as a service. And so what happened, the minute you start turning something that was uncommodified into this commodity, is that it finds its price level. And all of a sudden, parents were like, oh, yeah, we'll just come later now because we'll just pay them. We'll pay them whatever it costs to keep my kid, an extra 20 minutes. That's fine. And so they realized the errors of their ways. And they said, that's it. We're going, we're getting rid of the market. And, we're going back to the old way. And what happened? The lateness went even further because now the price was zero and the lateness went up. So if we merely say, all right, no, it's a commons now, away we go, but we haven't altered the framing in which we understand things, then we will actually get a proper tragedy of the commons, where now all of a sudden people are just behaving, by people I mean corporations in general, are going to be behaving rapaciously. So it's not merely enough to be able to imagine, to wave this magic wand and think, well, let's just go back to the commons, because commons require commoning. It requires being re-socialized into ways of caring for one another. And the care economy is something that I'm very interested in right now, and looking at the way that social movements around the world are really embracing this recognition that actually the climate crisis and the crisis that emerges from food imperialism is also a crisis of care. And the way that we flip that around is not to consume the way that we've been consuming, and not to require women's labor for free for care work in the way that we've been assuming that, and not to set the value of the environment to zero, but to refashion our relationships not only to one another, but with the rest of the web of life. And that's what a radical care economy might look like, in which food features, but also care for the earth and a restitution for the damage that's been done.
Now, I'm not trying to put the onus on the individual here, but knowing what you know about food systems, what actually goes through your mind when you're standing in the supermarket aisle and you're trying to decide what to have for dinner?
It's mainly get me out of here. Which is, I think, a reasonable response, because if you're able to get your food from a local farmer's market or, from a community-supported agriculture thing, then that's usually better. More money's going to the farmer, and you're going to eat more seasonally, and all the rest of it. But in general, I'm trying to. I'm trying to read the labels like everybody else. I mean, in general, I try and buy organic food because I care about workers. There's definitely, it's really interesting here in the US to look at the schism between people who want organic food because their body is a temple, and they don't want to pollute their precious bodily fluids. And there's definitely a kind of weird race panic, fascist kind of vibe associated with not wanting impurities in your body. And then there's a sort of the left approach to thinking about organic food, which is, I don't want anyone to be exposed to this stuff because they have families to go home to, and they're being exposed to it at levels far higher than any trace amount that's going to be on this food. So thinking about organic food, I think, is important as a worker, a worker dignity measure. Making sure that things are fair trade, and again, I think there's plenty of reason to criticize fair trade, but it's helping farmers hang on by their fingernails, and I would rather they did that than not. But there are other ways, for example, of getting your bananas that would involve cooperative supply chains, and thinking about if you're going to be in a supermarket, at least let it be a co-op. These might be ways of shopping smarter. But again, Emma, I mean, you're right. Ultimately, I, like everyone else, has had a moment of just like, for fuck's sake, when looking at these two labels of like, should I go for local or organic, and is it sustainable? And what the fuck does this mean? I've never seen this label before, and now, what is this genuinely a good thing? What's regenerative? Is regenerative good? Turns out that here in the US, there's one regenerative certification that you if you look for it, it means that workers are paid well, and that's a good thing. But all the other ones are right-wing crazies who just want to make sure that you're able to snort raw milk off toilet bowls or whatever it is. I mean, I don't know what the fuck they're doing, but the vision here is that the supermarket is again an engine for paralysis, and that's why I think Get Me Out of Here is a reasonable response, because in the supermarket you are being made to be the guy with you're being turned into somebody who's required to be a nutrition expert and a supply chain expert and a labor expert and an environment expert, a water quality expert. No one can do all of that, and the label is trying to lull you into some sort of weird proxy. The label's been put there by the corporation to say, just pat you on the head, and it's there for you. It's not there for the environment. So let's, I think the less time spent inside one of these places, the better.
And finally, if you could give one piece of advice for concerned listeners wanting to support a fairer food system, it's probably not choosing the right product in a supermarket, but what would that be? What's your take home?
The great joy and tragedy of this moment is that we need to organize against incipient fascism. If you watch the news every day with dread, and you are just mortified at what's happening, and the sort of the lurch of politics and the rise of vast empires of intolerance fueled by Elon Musk and his friends, then the only way to fight that is not by doom scrolling, but actually putting your phone down and going out to organize. And that necessity can also be a pathway to better in the world. Being part of social movements, being part of organizing, being part of groups that are fighting the good fight. And I'm lucky enough to be a member of or a comrade with lots of different movements. And I think if you look again at the history of imperialism, it hasn't ended because people wrote letters by themselves to their elected representatives or their unelected representatives. It ended through organizing. It ended through not just, dear sir, please do this. It ended through militant political organizing. It ended through left-wing organizing. But in the food system, capitalism always produces its own gravediggers, which is the sort of Marxist idea. We could be gravediggers for this too if we wanted. And finding those comrades and those movements gets a shovel in our hands and gets us to feel more powerful than we do right now.
Professor Raj Patel, we really want to thank you for the incredible work that you do. Of course, giving up some of your super precious time. So many takeaway messages. I mean, the key one that sticks in my head now is cheap is not the same as affordable. And that's such a small statement with such a big, deep meaning.
Well, no, Ben, Neil, and Emma, thank you so much for the invitation. And I'm really excited to hear where this journey for food imperialism ends up.